This week in On the Go, getting up to speed on a fast-moving urban transportation trend, micromobility. Brandon Campbell is here to tell us about the city of Tampa's growing program.
Micromobility in Tampa really takes the form of bike share and scooter share, and soon to be some other form factors that help to really fill in a gap that would otherwise be taken up by a car trip.
Hello and welcome to On the Go, the T-Barta podcast, where we discuss the latest in transit and transportation all across Tampa Bay. I'm your host, T-Barta Communications Director Chris Jadek, and today we are talking about micromobility and the city of Tampa's experience with that as Tampa's program transitions from a pilot project to a permanent one. Our guest is Brandon Campbell, Smart Mobility Manager with the city of Tampa. Brandon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
To start, I'd like to learn a little more about you and what you do. So let's start with this. What is a Smart Mobility Manager?
I actually get that question asked of me a lot. Smart Mobility Division at the City of Tampa is one of our 5 divisions within the mobility department, and we deal with everything in the right-of-way that is electric or is networked. So I tell people if it can shop or talk, it's come through my office. That ranges from our traffic signal and ITS network to our micromobility program to street lighting to anything that even goes through right-of-way permitting. So a lot of the small wireless facilities have been keeping my right-of-way permitting team busy, and those sorts of things come and go for us.
Yeah, it seems like you have a full plate for sure. Now, I see that you've only been in Tampa for about 5 years. Tell us where you grew up, went to school, and what led you to the Sunshine State.
I actually grew up in Missouri, and I went to the University of Missouri, and I worked for the Missouri Department of Transportation for about 12 years. So I spent a pretty good chunk of my life there. And whenever I decided that it was time to make a change, my wife told me we're not moving anyplace colder than Missouri, and Florida always has traffic engineering positions open. Having a background in traffic engineering, I found a good spot here in the city of Tampa, and it's been a great 5 years.
Well, as someone who is also a transplant, I'm from Ohio. I certainly do understand why you're here, and I join you in that sentiment. Now, as part of your job, I understand you manage Tampa's Smart Cities program. To those not familiar with smart cities, tell us what those are and how Tampa is embracing that concept.
Smart cities is really the idea that we use data and instrumentation, and sometimes that's in the right of way, sometimes it's not, but to provide services for our city to really improve the residents' lives. For us, we're building our Smart Cities program from the transportation network because we have an existing reach, because we have some expertise and some staff that can help to implement some of those programs, and because we needed somebody to step up and do it.
Now let's turn to the topic at hand, micromobility. That's similar to another buzzword in transportation today, microtransit. How are those different terms, and just what are we talking about with each?
Micromobility and microtransit are similar in that they are both more of an on-demand transportation service. When it comes to microtransit, generally that means pooling trips, using an on-demand service, and using transit in a way that really is just a smaller form factor. Most of the time, those things come in the form of vans or sometimes even passenger cars. You may get into the backseat of a car with a stranger that happens to be going to the same place at the same time as you. Micromobility, on the other hand, is more focused on having devices at the ready in the right of way that you can use and basically rent on a per trip basis.
Well, let's turn now to Tampa's micromobility program with an overview on what that is. So what is your elevator pitch, so to speak, when you need to succinctly describe this program?
Micromobility in Tampa really takes the form of bike share and scooter share, and soon to be some other form factors that help to really fill in a gap that would otherwise be taken up by a car trip. One of the things that we've learned in the last 3 years or so with our program is that these devices have been used really to take an average of a 1.25 mile trip. And particularly in Tampa, that's generally going to be somebody getting in their own car, driving across downtown, say, going to a meeting or going out to dinner, or using a single occupant vehicle to get where they want to go. And we've been able to replace some of those trips with the micromobility program.
So is this one of the solutions to the first mile, last mile issue that we hear a lot about in transit, where obviously transit can take you to major destinations, but your meeting may still be a fair distance away, not so far that transit's going to take you there, but it's also a long walk.
Absolutely. When we are citing our endpoints or our docking stations, our hubs where these devices are going to be set up from day to day by the providers, one of the factors that is always going to come into play is where's the nearest transit stop. It's certainly not the only thing, but it's definitely something that is a consideration whenever we are working with the providers to distribute them throughout the community.
Now, there are a lot of different vehicle types with names that many of us may not be familiar with. I've heard about e-bikes, sit-down and stand-up scooters, e-cargo bikes. Can you walk us through each of the vehicle options that are being made available to shared mobility users here in Tampa?
The first phase of our micromobility program started several years back with our bike share deployment. That's the simplest form of just a manually powered bicycle that you can pay a subscription service to or a subscription fee to and pick those up at one of several locations downtown. The next phase was the pilot of our stand-up scooter program. And those are going to be single occupant electric scooters that you see scooting around downtown. We're moving from a pilot to a permanent program that's going citywide. And in addition to the stand-up scooters with this program, we have scooters with seats to help out and meet the needs of people who might have different abilities. We have e-bikes, which are really just electric powered bicycles. You ride them like any other bicycle, but they have an electric motor that kicks into gear whenever you're pedaling. And we have some e-cargo or multi-rider e-bikes that are being deployed to a smaller scale.
Well, let's talk about the adaptive vehicles just a little bit. As you know, individuals with disabilities might have some special needs, but you've taken that into consideration, haven't you?
We have. We wanted this citywide program to be one that meets the needs of all users of all abilities. So we've put in a requirement within these contracts to provide 1% of the fleet size as an adaptive vehicle of some sort. We'll see different form factors, whether they are hand cycles or tricycles or something else that meets specific needs. And we're coordinating the usage of that and the rental of that through our disability advocacy groups, our partners.
So the electric vehicles, the powered vehicles are getting a lot of the attention these days because they're new, but are the regular pedal bikes still part of the shared micromobility program?
We do consider the shared bike system to be part of the micromobility program. It's a little more mature. We've had that for several years longer than we've had our pilot of the stand-up scooters. And so they're on a different contract cycle, but it all is part of the same program.
What other cities have embraced shared micromobility? Are there others that you try to emulate and perhaps model Tampa's program after?
There are around 200 different cities and college campuses that have micromobility programs, and they range from a fleet size of 35 scooters to several thousand. We try to keep in touch with other cities through the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO, through their bike share program and cities only knowledge exchange program. We also try to coordinate with neighboring cities like St. Pete and Orlando to see what they're doing, to see tweaks that we might be able to adopt that they've made, things that we might be able to emulate.
So would you say Tampa is at the forefront of this movement? You know, we're not the first, but it seems relatively new for a lot of urban areas.
It is pretty new still for urban areas. One thing that's been really impressive to me is to see how even in the last 3 years or so since we've had our scooter fleet, how the technology has matured, how they're forward thinking, and we still have a long way to go in terms of getting to a full maturation of the program. So we're right there with everyone else, working with those vendors and trying to provide our input on how they innovate.
Now, I know the program is moving to a more permanent status, but of course it started off as a pilot project, as a lot of these things do. And let's just focus on that right now. When you were the pilot, tell us how that started off, how big that might have been, and maybe some of the lessons you learned along the way that helped shape the program you want to be in 2022 and beyond.
Our pilot program started in early 2019 with the intent to make it a 1-year pilot. And it's been an interesting, I'll say 3 years now, almost 3 years, when we've had to extend it for various reasons, most notably because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And something, again, that I've been impressed with the providers is to see how they respond to changing conditions. Something that I really appreciated that they did when COVID-19 was really starting to make a bigger impact on our community was to provide free rides to frontline workers. So if you needed to get to Tampa General Hospital and you lived in, say, Hyde Park area or beyond, you could hop on a scooter and get there and maybe rely on something that was less enclosed if you were used to using transit instead. So through those 2 or 3 extensions that we've had, we have again been working with other communities and trying to get some input on what other people have seen. We worked also with USF. They did a study for us on the effects of the pilot or the efficiency and the benefits of that pilot. They made several recommendations that we have incorporated into our upcoming full citywide program. And some of those concerned equity and being able to provide this availability to communities all across the city. Some of those recommendations included structuring the pricing such that the incentive-disincentive structure helped us to accomplish the ends that we were getting toward, and to increase our educational efforts. Obviously, safety is a primary concern with any transportation program. This one is no exception to that.
Well, there's no doubt COVID changed so much of our lives, including the way we move. So taking that into consideration, how successful would you say the pilot was based on the usage? Did the usage figures match up with what your expectations were?
To be honest, I don't know if we had any expectation on exactly how many trips we were looking at, but we've seen in the last 3 years over 2.3 million trips that have been taken by our micromobility program. And for that to have taken place is just kind of astonishing, considering how much we've been through as a city and as a society in the last 3 years. So over those 2.3 million trips, we've found that the average trip length is about 1.25 miles, I think I mentioned. And we've seen some usage patterns as well that have been really interesting to see. The downtown area, and particularly the west portion of downtown, we'll say the pathway sort of between Armature Works and down in the convention center area, that's been one of our primarily used routes. But then I think maybe one of the most interesting stories of the pilot program so far has been the usage in the College Hill and Belmont Heights neighborhood. And if you're not familiar with where that is, it is north of Ybor City, north of the I-4 corridor. It's highly residential. We've got a community center there and a park there. And it's certainly a different use case than we're seeing in downtown. In the downtown area, there's probably more of a mix of leisure or fun trips. And whenever you look at communities like College Hill, Belmont Park, we can extrapolate from what we're seeing in the patterns that people are using these, again, as a true transportation gap filler and not just for having fun.
So the pilot was successful, and you certainly gathered a lot of information from that. Now you're looking to make this a permanent program, a permanent fixture. Where do we stand with that? And what will it mean for city residents who have gotten used to micromobility options?
We have already signed contracts on a couple of the form factors that we are planning to have out on the right of way. So the seated scooters, the e-bikes, we have contracts on 3,000 e-bikes from Spin and Lime, respectively, and 1,500 seated scooters from Razor. We also have a contract on our 1,000 e-cargo bikes from Hopper. The next phase that really is likely to get actually put out on the street at the same time as these devices is the citywide expansion of our stand-up scooters, which is under review right now. We've received proposals and we expect to have a contract Probably in late January. It could be a little bit later than that, early February.
Now, I must admit, I have not ridden an e-scooter, although I have used bike share in other cities. So take me through that process. Let's say I'm in downtown Tampa and I come across a bike or a scooter. What do I need to do to take it for a ride?
Typically, it involves downloading the application for the individual provider, putting in some payment and personal information, scanning the QR code that's on that device, and hopping on and taking off. It's a fairly simple process, and they charge an unlock fee and by the minute for the stand-up scooters. For the bike share, there are some more subscription options that are available. You can pay them a certain amount and just have access to a certain number of trips over the course of a year.
So I see these vehicles all around town. I take it, if I find one, it's got the barcode on it, I've got the account. I essentially, if I haven't already signed up, I can sign up, or if I already have the account, I can kind of scan it in and take that there. There's no central terminal, I guess, where I have to go to get these vehicles, right?
That's correct. The one exception to that is with the adaptive vehicles that are being deployed as part of this permanent program. We have several, up to 75 vehicles that are being deployed that are maybe three-wheel vehicles and things that may be manually powered by hand, things that are specifically meant to meet needs of users with different abilities. And those will be more of a checkout system that we're working with our disability advocacy partners to arrange.
Now, parking meters used to be controlled by dimes, nickels, quarters. Of course, they've all gone electronic too. I have used Park Mobile and signed up for that. Is the process similar to that? It sounds like it is. Whereas if I don't have an application, I come across it, you say I can download it, but is it simple enough that I could just pull out my phone probably in a few minutes, get signed up?
Yes, it is if you have a smartphone. Each of the providers do also, I should mention, have some options for checking out a vehicle if you do not have a smartphone. Those are a little bit different from one provider to the next.
So for the most part, there's no central terminal where these have to go. But when I'm done, any requirements on where that scooter or bike has to end up?
With the current pilot phase, we don't have a dock-to-dock system, which means preferably you would park those at some sort of bicycle infrastructure, maybe a bike rack, or you can leave them on the sidewalk, but really the requirement is to leave an ADA accessible route. So that means basically putting them by the furniture strip near where benches or tree wells would be on the sidewalk.
And I think, like you, I've seen them from time to time on the side of the road. Someone could pick that up and ride it, but somebody might not. Does somebody go around and see if this is not in the right place and kind of gather them up once in a while?
There are a couple of different ways that errant scooters or scooters that are sort of off on an island get rebalanced. Some of that just comes automatically from the providers. They just know that a scooter might be in a location that is not a typical deployment area. They would just go pick it up. They would have that feed within their application, their backend application, to tell them to go get it. If there's one that's in a place where it really shouldn't be, or if it's tipped over, or if there's some sort of problem with it, you can always contact us or contact the vendor directly, and they're usually pretty responsive about getting those taken care of.
Well, no doubt Tampa, like every other municipality that is getting into micromobility, has to consider the legal ramifications and responsibilities. Let's start by talking about where you ride them. What is the law when it comes to where you can and cannot ride e-scooters and bikes and things like that?
State law treats all of these devices basically like a bicycle, which means that any sort of bicycle infrastructure, whether that is a separate bicycle track or a bike lane or a shared use path, is fair game for those devices to operate. So there's also some limited use that state law would allow on sidewalks and on low-speed roads. But we also have some areas where, as a city, we've chosen to restrict them. So, for example, on the Bayshore sidewalk on 7th Avenue through Tampa and on the Riverwalk itself, they're not allowed to be ridden.
So when it comes to sidewalks, what is the law regarding bikes or even the bike share? I'm not even sure. Can you ride a bike on a sidewalk, or are you restricted to the street?
So generally, the law directs you to ride in the street, but sidewalk use is allowed, but in a limited fashion. I'm not sure I have a real succinct summation of how the law reads on that.
Fair enough. Any other laws that apply to micromobility, such as helmets? Do you have to wear a helmet?
A helmet is strongly recommended by us, but the law itself only requires helmet use by riders 16 and under. And in Tampa, the micromobility providers, the scooter providers at least, restrict the usage to riders that are age 18 and up.
Now, safety is always a priority. What's been the track record on that, not only for micromobility users, but also for drivers and pedestrians who are now sharing the roads and walkways with people using this type of transit?
Overall, I would say the safety record has been positive. We've had 2 fatal crashes on stand-up scooters over the course of the pilot program. And while tragedies, they were under some unusual circumstances. One of the things that we've done in order to move from our pilot to our permanent program is to have that USF study look at several aspects of the program, one of which was safety, one of which was what have the records of actual crashes and hospital visits been, and then to recommend some specific actions on how to better educate end users on how to use the devices. And each of the vendors have committed to doing some first ride events and some educational community outreach events as they roll out their program. And some of those things have been virtual over the last 18 to 24 months, but they are really trying to partner with some of our outreach professionals in the area to tell people exactly what the risks are and how they can mitigate those risks.
Now, that sounds like a very proactive approach, so I do appreciate that. Tampa is a big city, and we've talked about some of the areas where it's most popular, but let's go back to that before we move on too much further. Any areas where you will not find micromobility or where you say, this just doesn't work in this part of the city?
As we roll out our permanent program, it will truly be citywide. There are specific facilities that they won't be allowed. I mentioned Bayshore, 7th Avenue, the Riverwalk. There are some private roads that have asked us to geofence the usage and exclude them. But generally speaking, it will be a citywide program as we roll out the permanent program.
And as I understand, there's some technology that stops these vehicles, cuts off the power, so to speak, if they go outside of a geofence of some sort. Can you talk about that a little bit, how that works?
Each of the devices has a GPS receiver, and their onboard computing system will literally stop the vehicle if you ride it into a no ride zone. Likewise, if you're going to park it and it's an area that we don't want the scooters left, they can create no parking zones based on the GPS signal.
Well, in both the pilot and the upcoming program, you've agreed to work with several micromobility companies, not just one. Can you start by giving us an overview on some of those companies and what each may be contributing to this program?
I may have to hold back a little bit on some of the specific differences between each of the providers because we're in the midst of a procurement process with them. But I will say each of them brings different things to the table. They might bring some different technologies that are on board the devices themselves. They'll bring different management and rebalancing practices, different maintenance schedules, and different ways of outreach to the community, as well as how they interact with our internal stakeholders. So that competitive process for procuring them is really the same between the pilot and the permanent program, in that we are going out for proposals, scoring those based on several different criteria and selecting the best responses.
And if you can, let's talk about that criteria a little bit. As you vet these companies, what are some of the things you're looking for and hoping to find in the better ones?
We've asked them to provide us with descriptions of their methodologies for preventing sidewalk riding where it's not allowed. And that's been an interesting process to sort of look through and see what they're proposing. That's an area of the program that is still maturing and emerging. And there are really some differences between how each of the vendors are attempting to handle that. Likewise, we like to see what their plan is for maintenance, what their plan is for charging, what their plan is for rebalancing. And they do each bring a little bit different approach to it.
And let me ask you about charging. Obviously, the electric bikes, things like that have to be charged. Do they charge off the same chargers, or given that you're working with different companies, are they, proprietary to each? And if a bike is left by the side of the roadway, how does it get charged up? I guess there's a lot of questions you've been considering. So without having to tackle all of that, just give me a little insight on how that recharging process works.
It can be different from one provider to the next. Some of them have removable batteries, and they will send out a staff member to swap those batteries if the only need for the device is charging, and then take those batteries back to some central point for charging. Even right now, Spin has a few charging stations that are out near the right of way, but on private property. So a user can actually pull in and plug it in. There are companies that build charging stations that are vendor agnostic. So it could be that we end up with charging stations that they all sort of contribute to the installation of, and then can have a common source for multiple vendors. So there's several different methods. Sometimes they'll have a gig worker come and just pick up a few scooters and take it back to their home and charge overnight. And there's several different methods that all sort of accomplish the same thing.
Now, these are public-private partnerships. Tell us what the obligations and responsibilities are for each side of that, starting with the city of Tampa's responsibility and what you in turn require of each company that you're going to work with.
Our responsibility as an agency is to permit the program, to coordinate with internal stakeholders, to monitor how things are going, and to give feedback to the vendors, and really to manage the process of mitigating impacts, mitigating problems that we see arise. The vendors themselves are responsible for all of the maintenance, charging, deployment, everything that has to do with the fleet itself. All of the payment exchange between end users and the program goes through those for-profit companies as well. They are obligated to respond to us on different things for given different timeframes. So if we tell them to remove the fleets for an impending tropical storm or something like that, they have to actually get those off the right of way and warehoused within 24 hours. So we really have some shared responsibilities in terms of monitoring how things are going and sharing information back and forth about how best to manage those processes.
And what is the city's financial investment in this project? I take it Tampa has to obviously put up some money for this. What are those funds going for?
This is actually a revenue positive program for us. We have fees. We have both permit fees and vehicle fees for the vendors that they have to pay us in order to utilize the right of way for operating. One of the things, again, that the USF study told us that we might want to reconsider is how those fees are structured. But over the course of the last 3 years, we have collected about $1 million from the program that's then been put back to use with the monitoring platform that we've got and some of the operating needs of our department. So our Vision Zero program, some of the things that we've done with infrastructure that's specifically geared toward the bicycle and micromobility programs.
Well, that's excellent news that this program is going to be revenue positive. I know we all applaud that. One of the lessons learned in the pilot is that not everyone who uses a scooter is responsible with it. In October, a number of e-scooters were fished out of the Hillsborough River. Tell us what happened there and what action is being taken to minimize a repeat.
So we've had a couple of different cleanups of the Hillsborough River that have been led by a volunteer organization called Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful. And they have some expert divers that have been great partners for us and for the micromobility companies. One of the things that we have found out in talking to the scooter providers is that they're realizing that the people who have vandalized their property and have thrown it in the river are not necessarily the same as those who have used the product. They've implemented some measures, some no parking zones near the river bridges to help mitigate that. And even before this cleanup that you mentioned, they had been able to retrieve some from the water that were visible. The ones that were actually found over the last few months by the expert divers from Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful, had been submerged in murkier water or deep water. They weren't visible from the surface. So it was less clear to the providers exactly where they were and how to retrieve them. So we've been really appreciative of Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful, especially, but also of the vendors as they've responded to that need and put in resources and helped to get those away from the river after those divers had gotten them from being submerged.
Well, kudos to those volunteers, but if they weren't there, the responsibility for getting these falls on the companies. Is that correct? It's not a city responsibility?
That is correct. And I think the problem with those that had been in the river, again, the GPS signals on those scooters don't necessarily tell you exactly where they are in the water. So there was some lack of clarity on exactly where some of these devices were and how to get them out. I think they've seen a healthier attrition rate of their fleet. Basically, they've seen fewer people taking them and doing bad things with them after they've implemented some of these measures. And over the course of 3 years, sometimes these things sort of build up and we have to address them now.
That's for sure. Well, I appreciate you discussing that. It's certainly a topic of concern, but it seems like you're being proactive about it and have a good plan moving forward. And the companies have accepted that responsibility as well, too. So good for them. Traffic congestion is a concern all across Tampa Bay, and that's one reason TBARTA is working to help us find transit solutions to help get people where they need to go. Is it a goal of this program to also reduce traffic congestion in the city, or do you have any knowledge that it has done so in other cities that have used micromobility?
It is definitely a goal of the program to reduce reliance on single occupancy vehicles. One of the things that the USF study looked at was how many vehicles are we reducing through this pilot project? And they said that we reduced the equivalent of 47 vehicles per year with just the limited deployment within our downtown area with the pilot. And that's not a whole lot of vehicles, but as we expand geographically, as the program itself becomes more popular, we expect that to grow. And I don't know if we'll have people who decide not to buy a car just because these sorts of devices are available, but we're filling in a gap for people who otherwise don't have transportation for some of these short trips, or who would hop in that car and maybe they could just leave it parked.
Well, technology is always evolving. I think you noted that a little bit earlier. So the e-bikes we use today may not be the same ones in the program tomorrow. Do you have a sense of what's on the horizon when it comes to shared micromobility, or how you think the program may evolve in the years ahead?
There are a couple of things that I'm kind of excited about with respect to technology in this sector. One of the things is mobility as a service. We are actually entering into a pilot with a company called Move It that is folding in the micromobility program as a part of a service offering of every transit and transportation option within the city. And I expect those sorts of initiatives to help increase usefulness and the popularity of some of these programs, including our scooter program, to be able to offer some additional route planning and the chaining together of different modes for the end user. Like I mentioned, we're still only a few years into scooters even being a thing and being out on the roadway anywhere. And they are continuing to innovate. They're continuing to increase some of their safety programs and some of their location-based needs when it comes to riding on the sidewalk or better geofencing or better GPS. And those things I expect to really continue to mature as we move on, especially in the next year or so.
Well, you mentioned mobility as a service. That's something else we'd like to talk to you about at a future date because there's a whole lot there. So very briefly, tell us, what is mobility as a service?
Mobility as a service is really the idea that instead of purchasing individual trips and booking things in different applications and taking a fragmented approach to getting where you want to go, that you bring it all in one place and you just purchase the service that you want to get from point A to point B. You purchase your mobility, you purchase the service of that mobility. Some of those things that are needed for mobility as a service include integrating different forms, different payment forms, different mode choices. And we're working toward trying to unify the approach to providing service to our end users.
There's a whole lot there to talk about. I look forward to coming back to you perhaps next year, because I know Tampa's working on that program too. So congratulations on being forward thinking on that. Before we go, I want to ask you one final question and see what your personal experience has been with using micromobility in Tampa. How have you been using it, and has that experience helped you in designing and implementing the program we have today?
I've used pretty much every form factor that we offer. The e-cargo bikes haven't been put out on the road yet, so I haven't tried one of those. But I've used them to get to meetings. I've used them to get across town in a hurry. But one of the things that's been the most fun and the most useful was that we had a couple of different events where we were having a meeting in the field and we needed to cover a significant amount of ground and look at some of the field conditions of sidewalks and other infrastructure. And the group that was part of that, one was a group of community members, one was a group of professionals, and we all used seated scooters to help us get our work done. And to me, it was a great use case. It was a really good illustration of how they can be useful in unexpected ways. And something else that surprised me when we were out there was that we had several people in the community stop and ask us about the devices and when they might be able to use them. So we're looking forward to the deployment. We're looking forward to being able to provide a service in areas of the city that didn't currently have it, and really seeing how that blossoms.
Well, Brandon, that's a good note to end on. Once again, Brandon Campbell is the Smart Mobility Manager with the City of Tampa. I'm Chris Jadek, T-BARTA Communications Director, and you've been listening to On the Go, the Transit and Transportation Podcast from the Tampa Bay Area Regional Transit Authority.